I talked about this in a recent Quick Bites video, or at least one that I recorded recently, but in February 2025, I watched an episode of the Theo Von podcast at the request of a boy. As a self-identified omega, ooh, heat cycle, get me pregnant, I often do things the men I like ask of me. This episode was with Galloway, and it was largely about masculinity. I found it intriguing because masculinity simply isn't something I really think about all that often. Conservatives like to appear in my comments when I critique conservative figures or movements and talk about how I'm not a macho alpha bro. I'm a soy boy. Apparently this is meant to be an insult, but I just don't care. If I were insecure in my masculinity, I could see how those comments could be cutting, but I'm not an alpha type, so I'm not insecure in my maleness. Yes, a bunch of alpha men who are loudly performatively cruel are attempting to achieve a masculinity that they do not feel at home in. It's kind of what it all is. I talk about that a bit in my video over the American Communist Party because the ACP is led by grifters, men who have to perform male drag to feel better about themselves. But I don't fault normal people for whom masculinity is important. A lot of guys out there are concerned with what it means to be a man. Regardless of what caused this concern, be it existential dread, searching for meaning against the sea of nihilism, or ingrained patriarchy, it exists. So I found the episode pretty interesting to listen to. At one point in the video, Theo Von starts talking about male privilege. He takes issue with the idea that his life has been good because he's a man. It made me pause. At first, I rolled my eyes. That's not what privilege means in this context. Instinctually, I thought he was being disingenuous. After all, didn't we all learn about privilege and what it actually means back in 2015? God, that was a decade ago, kill me. But I'm going to take the advice of that famous adage I often ignore and find inapplicable in a lot of situations. Don't attribute to malice what can be attributed to stupidity, or let's paraphrase that because stupidity isn't quite right here. Don't attribute to malice what can easily be attributed to ignorance. Ignorance isn't necessarily a bad thing. 2015 was a decade ago. I started my senior year of high school a decade ago. Gay marriage became a thing in this country a decade ago, and I'm still not married, and so that is years upon years of me not needing to learn this, and so not being in those spaces where this would really be taught. That leads me to ask, is it being taught? Or are others like me simply assuming that everyone already knows this? Well, maybe everyone doesn't. So apologies to everyone else who might find this video conceit to be a bit boring and basic. That's okay. It doesn't have to be for you. If you agree with Theo Von and you bristle automatically at the idea of having something like male privilege, then I hope that you'll stick around. First leg up. What is privilege? That's a simple answer. Privilege is a word I always assume has a D in it. I want to spell it Priviledge. But unlike me, privilege isn't right with a D buried in its end. So let's just straight up define it. Here's what Webster's dictionary says. A right or immunity granted as a peculiar benefit, advantage, or favor. I'm sure you're shocked that I didn't pull a philosophy tube and put a joke there instead. Granted is an interesting verb, isn't it? Granted implies the ability to take it away. How many of us grew up hearing our parents say that a phone or a game or a car are privileges and not rights? That's normally said to avoid difficult conversations about economics, or it's said due to one lacking responsibility, or most often as an express defense of punishments. You don't do your chores, your mom takes your phone, you get upset, she says a phone is a privilege, not a right. Typical conversation, right? So we tend to associate the word privilege with the word grant, and the word grant with the ability of removal. I wonder if there isn't an instinctual aversion to privilege discourse in a political context, in some because it feels as though it is saying these identity categories, many of them which are social constructions of one sort or another, can be taken away. And that's frightening. Car privilege means you can have your access to your car taken. Are there people out there who hear male privilege and associate it with that? Maybe not consciously, but on a subconscious level. Do they feel this implies their maleness is a category which can be taken away from them for bad behavior? Here's a different way of putting it from Peggy McIntosh. Privilege exists when one group has something of value that is denied to others simply because of the groups they belong to, rather than because of anything they've done or failed to do. It's worth noting that privilege is not necessarily an individual having something valuable. In this definition, privilege is when one is not automatically denied the potential of having said thing because of the groups they belong to. Privilege in these contexts is often about lack, not about having. It's about not having certain roadblocks that are placed in front of other people. This definition does not mean there are no roadblocks. It does not mean your road is smooth, and it doesn't mean you don't have to walk anywhere. Nowhere in the definition does it say having privileges of some sort means you didn't work hard. So this sort of thing is abstract, isn't it? What is privilege is something we'll have to answer on a case-by-case basis. Let's get started. Second leg up, male privilege. Men often get real pissed when you imply that we've got it easier than women. They dislike the idea of privilege. The word feels like by simple virtue of being a man, they were handed everything. So, what is male privilege? The Girl Scouts of America reports that 1/10 of girls are catcalled before they turn 11. Imagine being a prepubescent child and discovering that much larger, older, stronger creatures desire you, with a need you probably haven't even begun to awaken. According to the National Sexual Violence Research Center, 1/5 of all women have been raped or have experienced attempted rape at some point in their lives. About 20% of women compared to 2.6% of men. When these statistics are pointed out, people are quick to jump out and act as if we are saying those male victims do not matter. But that's not what is being said. And I'll make it even clearer. I've been assaulted 3 times, basically one way in every way a man can be. As a male victim, I am of course concerned by this. Any assault on anyone is too many. That does not change the fact that by the mere fate of being a man, you are less likely to be assaulted. Getting treated like that by another person messes you up. It took me a year or so to be able to watch a film with an assault scene after my own experiences. There's a children's movie out there that I flat out can't watch because it was on when a man did things. It sucks. It does. It really fucking sucks. Male privilege does not prevent men from suffering. It does change the likelihood of that suffering. When these statistics are pointed toward, the idea is not that men need to pump up their numbers. Those are rookie numbers. It's that we have a lot of work to do. Maybe it's easier for those of you who hate the idea of maleness providing a privilege to think of the opposite. Let's remove all ideas that privilege is used to describe differences in oppression, and instead merely talk about prejudice. In her video on men, YouTuber ContraPoints talks about the different ways she's been treated by people. As a passing trans woman, she has the recollection now of how society treats 1, a man, 2, a feminine man, 3, a non-passing trans woman, and 4, a woman. What she has to say about this is that anecdotally and maybe in general, strangers have been nicer to her as a woman than they were when they viewed her as a man. She is not treated with the same suspicion, like she's some automatic threat. I've seen men quickly grow to resent that people hold them in fear when they themselves are a perfectly gentle or agreeable human. Speaking in very broad terms, you could view this social treatment as a sort of female privilege, though of course it's more complicated than that. This is like a simplification to prove a point. We can see how women not being treated as an automatic threat can be a privilege, and how at the same time it does not prevent horrible things from happening to women. This seeming advantage has not lowered the assault statistics we just discussed. If anything, this assumption of non-threat might be one of many factors in why those numbers are so abysmally high. Which is worse, having to prove yourself decent or having a nearly 1,000% increased likelihood of receiving sexual violence compared to your male counterparts? Luigi Mangione, the guy accused of killing the United Health CEO Brian Thompson, has been the subject of a prolonged sexualization campaign online. When reports came out that he might have recorded some sex tapes, people immediately clamored on Twitter for someone to hack and leak them. This is a sort of dehumanization. Luigi, for these people, stopped being a person. For the people obsessed with him, he is a symbol and a sex object. To a degree, Twitter does this with every mildly attractive famous person. A lot of it is harmless in the theoretical, but some of it is flat out disturbing. An OnlyFans guy on gay Twitter in March of 2025 posted a pornographic video in the style of a Get Ready With Me TikTok video. It received a lot of attention. He was mocked and ridiculed. He deleted the video from his Twitter page. Yet, people who saved his video continued to post it, to memify it, to share it with others who want it to watch. All of that is a strict violation of consent. It's disgusting behavior. Yet it wasn't really taken seriously. To a degree, it's easy to assume it wasn't taken seriously, that Luigi's sexualization isn't taken seriously because the two are men. Women are allowed to talk about harassment, one might argue, and have that conversation taken seriously. But is that true? It isn't really. I talked about this on my Taylor Swift video, which I should re-record with better audio maybe. At one point, she was the victim of an AI deepfake porn operation. Twitter disabled all searches for her name while it scrambled to get rid of this rampant sexual harassment. The spaces I was watching at the time did call this out, but some of them made sure to downplay it at the same time because it was Taylor who was a victim, a rich woman. Women's nudes are regularly leaked. This has been a thing since the internet has existed. The current president of the United States, as of recording, bragged about grabbing a woman by the genitalia. Take a second to imagine the opposite. Imagine a female candidate for president was caught on video or audio bragging about grabbing a man by the dick without consent. Would you excuse that? Speaking of male genitalia, in 2018, Reagan appointee and federal judge Bernard Friedman struck down the federal ban on female genital mutilation, which is less commonly known as female circumcision. The Trump administration decided not to appeal his ruling. A little under half of states at the time did not ban FGM. As far as I can tell, there are no such bans on MGM, the old movie studio with the roaring lion. Why is it roaring, you might ask? Because underneath that logo, it's undergoing a non-anesthetized circumcision. Talk about ouchie. Why do we circumcise? For some, it's a religious practice, though I don't find that defense particularly sound. We tend to rightly oppose FGM even when done for religious reasons. We oppose biblical stoning, so on and so forth. Most proponents of MGM bans don't seem opposed to religious carve-outs, at least not at the moment. Oftentimes, it's for aesthetic purposes. Sitcoms and raunchy comedy movies from the 90s and 2000s feature plenty of jokes about American women preferring cut men. As a cook connoisseur, I can definitively say, like white and red wines, both delicious. The biggest indicator of whether or not a guy will be snipped is whether or not his father is. Most people, though, when defending the practice, not necessarily saying the actual reason they want it, will instead pivot to the supposed health benefits. Circumcision is associated with lower risk of penile cancer and potentially cervical cancer. It can lower risks of contracting HPV, specifically when having sex with a woman, which sounds like uncircumcised guys should be super healthy and hop in my DMs. The cervical cancer bit is about HPV though, so having safe sex is the better mitigator than circumcision, by far, quite obviously. If these people actually cared about health, they'd be pushing for comprehensive sexual education as a requirement in US public schools. They tend not to be doing that though. So it isn't really about health. The penile cancer thing is apparently because dudes who keep it unwashed get infections and more UTIs, at which point the answer is wash yourself. Oh, the horror. In the vast majority of cases, the medical benefits are minuscule and can be achieved at better rates using other cutting-edge medical techniques like taking a bath. Anecdotally, while FGM is rightfully taken seriously, anti-circumcision activists are widely made fun of. Even calling it MGM can be controversial because it might cause those who have been circumcised to develop a complex, thinking they are mutilated and thereby undesirable, and at the end of the day, that's not helpful to anyone. Still, this is a fight for bodily autonomy. I've talked about this before, but when my home state of Georgia passed a ban on genital surgeries, they wanted to target trans kids, but they specifically wrote in exemptions for medically unnecessary circumcisions and cosmetic genital reconfiguration and shaping for intersex infants. That is gross. It was a gross thing they did. So theoretically, we can conceptualize the relative seriousness with which FGM is held versus that of MGM as a sort of privilege. It's also pretty easy to say that for the majority of men, circumcision doesn't really affect their lives in a super meaningful way. If society were constructed the opposite way, then, with MGM being taken more seriously than FGM, it's easy to understand how privilege is not a statement on your merits or your efforts. Almost no child of any sex has any say at all in cosmetic genital surgeries. This difference is largely sex-based, beyond the personal choice of the individual subjected to the decision. In this way, privilege does not refer to personal choice or ability whatsoever. It is about the ways society itself is constructed. So, what is male privilege? Well, we're less likely to be assaulted. 2.6% of men versus 21% of women. Most of you guys are going unassaulted, and then there are spiders, gay orgs like me collecting them like they're goddamn infinity stones. Linguistically, our sexually based insults are female-centric. Slut and whore have somewhat lost their gendered implications, but man-whore is a word I grew up hearing all the time. It wasn't directed at me because I didn't pull any game until college, but still. Man is modifying whore. Female sexuality is the one that's demonized in our very language. Think about the use of bitch. When used against a woman, it typically means difficult, disagreeable, not submissive, rude, crazy, uptight. When used by a gay man against a woman, half the time it means yas queen. When women use it amongst themselves, it can carry both of the prior connotations or simply be a friendly remark, a reclamation of a word used to beat them down growing up. What I want to discuss, though, is its usage amongst men against each other. When a man calls another man a bitch, it can mean one of two things typically. One, a pussy, by which they mean coward and not the other C word. Again, we're associating femininity with negative traits. There is a sexism built into language. Two, a submissive. To call a man a bitch is to assert dominance over him, whether your own dominance or that of someone else. That pejorative gets a lot of use in sexual situations to express power play. Yes, if you call or get called a bitch in bed and you like it, that dirty talk is a degradation and domination kink, even if you think it's vanilla. Congrats, Christian Grey. Despite making up about half of the workforce in the US, women make up only a third of all CEO positions. This is not saying that if you are a male CEO or CEO candidate, you are not qualified. It is saying that there are female candidates who are similarly qualified, who get passed over for little reason other than their existence as a woman. That's not saying you're not good enough. A man's qualifications being allowed to speak for him is male privilege. It's not a bad thing. It is not saying that your abilities should not speak for you. It is saying that you are not given an additional roadblock toward success because of your maleness. Women are given additional hurdles due to their femaleness. Your lack of that additional hurdle is what is called privilege. The point of pointing this out is not to build a new hurdle on your road. It is so that we can remove the blocks from the other roads. The highway toward success might get more traffic, but you and your car will still be able to drive and speak for yourself. Think about this. Regardless of your opinion on abortion, cis men are perfectly capable of going around having unprotected sex and fulfilling their breeding kink without having to deal with the medical complications of pregnancy. Despite how they have tried, none of the guys I've been with have gotten me pregnant. Cis women, however, who go around fulfilling their own breeding kink, risk pregnancy. Pregnancy involves obvious physical and psychological changes during the gestation period. Birth can cause physical and psychological distress and adverse conditions. To give birth can be quite expensive. Miscarriages can be insanely traumatic. Birth often involves having to take off of work. This can affect pay and promotions. We cis guys are never subjected to that reality. The ability to go around having sex without risking the bodily changes of pregnancy in our own bodies is a privilege. It's a sort of biological advantage. At the moment, we haven't invented boy wombs, so it's also not a choice. No, I'm not making an argument against casual sex. I'm not telling straight guys to stop having one-night stands or friends with benefits or casual bro jobs. Saying that this is an aspect of male privilege does not mean the privilege itself is evil, nor are those of us who have it. It is simply an academic observation whose acknowledgement and evaluation we can use to understand society and potentially change it if we so choose. Maybe there's an evil scientist out there who is working on making the Omega-verse real so that Navy SEAL dude who wanted to make those DNC twinks his concubines could get the pregnant cis twink of his dreams. Speaking of, third leg up, straight privilege. There's a lot more we could get into with male privilege and how sexism permeates the world, from educational trends in the Middle East to the amount of young women who are subjected to child marriages, screeds about how disgusting their bodies and desires are, pay gaps, assumptions of irrationality, and so on and so forth. But there is something incredibly connected to male privilege and sexism, and that is straight privilege. If we are talking third legs, we need to talk sexuality. I'm a gay man. Gay marriage was not made legal until I was 17. Growing up in Kentucky, it seemed pretty clear that the only chances I had at having my future marriage be a possibility were through a SCOTUS case or through moving. Both ended up happening. I came out about 3 times over the course of my life. The first time was to a handful of friends. Through teasing and gossip, other friends and my older sister found out. Coming out was the subject of a speech I gave in my 11th grade English class. I was shivering whilst delivering it. It was terrifying. The last time was in a Facebook post my senior year of college. Every single time, I was scared. Straightness is assumed. Straight people do not have to deal with the anxiety of coming out. That is a privilege. That is a stress you don't have to deal with, and I'm happy that you don't. I prefer everyone lives happier, less stressful lives. The first man I dated would sometimes get really into his head about showing any sort of PDA. Some of that was his own personal issues with affection and commitment, but some of it was fear of homophobia. We lived in a liberal city known partially for its gay history. We got into an Uber once, and before the car arrived, he told me not to hold his hand. I was upset at first, but randomly in the middle of the drive, the driver started talking about how all of the ills of the world are on the backs of gay people. Like he was blaming COVID on us just existing. My then boyfriend had made the right call. Holding hands in that car would have been a bad idea. We had no way of knowing that going into it. While straight couples do have to consider the appropriateness of expressing certain levels of PDA in certain occasions and locations, there isn't typically a learned fear of violence for expressing affection for your partner in something so innocent as holding a hand. That lack of fear is a privilege. Saying that does not mean your life is great, or your relationships are great, or even that everyone accepts the relationships you get into. All it means is you don't have that additional fear to worry about. Around 2012, when I was reading articles about specific states legalizing gay marriage, I read a bunch of comments from anti-gay conservatives talking about how gay people are recruited via sexual abuse. It sent me into a slight spiral trying to figure out what abuse I suffered from whom and how I managed to block it out. You know, the guys who hurt me, they didn't do that until I was in college. Straight people are not told that their attraction, their crushes, their desires are the result of heavy abuse. They are not told that they are destined to be abusive people just the same. One of my more recent videos as of time of recording is about the log cabin Republicans. In it, I look at all of the GOP state platforms as of February 2025. Of the states that had platforms separate from the national one, nearly every single state GOP mentioned opposition to gay marriage. Straight privilege is not having a political party argue to break up your marriages. 2 states, Hawaii and Texas, explicitly endorse conversion therapy. Conversion therapy is the practice of attempting to change one's sexual orientation. There is no evidence that it works. There is plenty of evidence that it increases shame and suicidality. Kentucky state legislators are, as of time of recording, pushing a bill to protect conversion therapy. Straight children are not subjected to this torture. Plenty of LGBT children throughout history have been. Not getting tortured is a privilege. To point that out is not saying that you should be tortured, or that you didn't earn anything you have in your life, or that your life is not difficult. Every life has its problems. It's saying that we who haven't been tortured have an advantage on those who have been. We don't have to deal with that trauma. Until Bostock v. Clayton County, it was legal to discriminate against LGBT people in employment. Being gay could theoretically get you fired. SCOTUS correctly pointed out that this is sex discrimination. Straight privilege is not having a political party argue that employers should be able to discard you for the simple fact of being in a gay relationship. In my video going over the sponsors of the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, I talk about how one of the conservative think tanks argues that all discrimination against LGBT people should be legal, including in housing. I have never seen anyone argue that hotels have the right to refuse a family a room because there is a married man and woman. To not have to deal with that is a privilege. I segued into this by talking about sexism. How does that play into sexuality? As you might have gathered from the Bostock mention, a lot of homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, etc. is based in sexism. In a paper examining sexism and homophobia in custody hearings, Clifford Roski lays out an interesting legal pattern. Courts were concerned that gay fathers would raise effeminate sons, lesbian mothers would raise effeminate sons, and lesbian mothers would raise masculine daughters. The unmasculine stereotypes about gay men meant that no such bias was raised as a concern for gay fathers raising a daughter. What, in these cases, was meant by masculine and feminine? It meant both stereotypical gender roles and sexuality. A son was at risk for being unmasculine not merely in that he might defy gendered expectations, but that he might, in the opinions of those particular judges, lawyers, and those who testified, be more willing or likely to identify as LGBT or engage in gay activity or fantasy regardless of his eventual identification. In other words, they were not defining masculinity as a series of gendered stereotypes. It was not merely about performative aggression as it is so often laid out. Masculinity was defined against femininity and homosexuality. The masculinity of both masculine gay fathers and masculine lesbian mothers would be routinely dismissed by these courts as insufficient or non-existent. For those judges, lawyers, and testifiers, gender and sexuality are intrinsically mixed. To be a gay man is to be unmasculine, to be incorrectly gendered. Straight people were not seen as inherently dangerous to children. Their straightness was not used against them in custody hearings, and it wasn't seen as an affront to their gender. That is straight privilege. Describing the case of a gay child who was bullied into suicide, Jasmine Weatherhill writes, "As Seth's tormentors demonstrated, homophobia is frequently rooted in sexism. Homophobia and sexism both stem from the rigid gender hierarchy that exists in our culture. Society not only defines how males and females should behave, it also tells us that masculinity is better than femininity." Think of all the conservative gays who insist that they are normal, and by normal they mean masculine. They feel the need to define themselves against the bad gays, the feminine ones, in order to show that they are correctly gendered. This is a fight against traditional stereotypes. Because they feel an affection towards masculine identity that they are not afforded due to merely their sexuality, they feel compelled to perform a heightened masculinity and often a heightened aggression toward incorrectly gendered gay men. This has nothing to do with actual reality. It's a defense mechanism. You could say it's a response to being denied the straight privilege of accepted and assumed masculinity. Sexism is an ancient prejudice, much the same way homosexuality's association with femininity and its demonization is also ancient. Take the Greeks. Writing for Harrods, Terry Modelholm says, "After all, for many Greeks, male sexuality was essentially about power dynamics more than about age or gender. In bed, it all came down to two things: active versus passive. Being submissive, meaning playing the woman's part by being penetrated, was the most unmanly thing that a man could do, while being the penetrator was an act of dominance and power. A real man could play only an active role." The YouTuber ContraPoints discusses this idea when she lays out her theory of default heterosexual and sadomasochism in her video over Twilight. She lays out a series of opposite, seemingly opposed traits like dominant and submissive, and how those are separated in typical gendered stereotypes. Masculinity isn't simply masculine signifiers. It is sex and sexuality. To be a man is to exhibit certain sexual traits and proclivities. To be a man is to penetrate someone. According to Tony Ketty, eunuchs, whether castrated or born with undescended testes, etc., were not seen as fully male in the ancient world. In fact, they might have been viewed as a sort of third gender based on their sexual ability because, to give a kind of gross quote, they were unable to disseminate seed nor to receive it. Now, obviously they could receive it, just not in a way that made kids. So masculinity isn't merely penetration either. Castrated men can still stiffen up. It's about creation, farming, approaching godhood. Again, it's not merely gender, it's sexual behavior and capability. As such, we can see that anti-gay attitudes often arise, conscious or not, from anti-woman attitudes. Think about the classic question asked of gay male couples. Which of you is the woman, though? When people ask that, they're really asking, who is the bottom? Who is the penetrated? Because in their mind, to be penetrated is to be emasculated. It's to be the woman. Think of submissive straight men who like getting pegged by their girlfriends. They too are often viewed as incorrectly gendered. Unfortunately for the homophobic sexists out there, femme tops and mask bottoms exist. Mask subs and femme doms exist. Those combinations exist in straight, gay, and lesbian pairings. Because we did it with male privilege, let's do the same thing here. This presents a sort of mirror, doesn't it, where we can conceptualize a sort of gay privilege, ignoring any connotative connection between privilege and oppression. Gay men are allowed to be submissive. If you watch my videos, I joke about it all the time, because I don't really care about being a man. I don't feel any draw to perform a dominating personality foreign to my actual thoughts and desires. I am a combination of the trait on the DHSM graphic. I want to be both lover and beloved. I prefer to give and I prefer to submit. I enjoy possessing and being possessed. Who cares? Be who you are. But were I a heterosexual male, it would be more difficult to be so cute, submissive, and breedable, because to be so would be to call into question not only my sexuality, but my maleness. I also tend to conflate gender and sexuality in my own mind. I wrote about this in my poetry collection, A Museum of Art and Eggs, but as far as I do consider my gender and masculinity, I only really care about being a man insofar as other men desire me as a man. Really what that comes down to is I want to be gay married to a man, and that's really the only thing I care about as far as my own manhood. I'm neither particularly feminine nor masculine, and I don't care to perform either. What I am is sleepy. Still, gay privilege. It goes beyond a sort of allowed sexual expression that goes against DHSM. Although gay people are subjected to misgendering, sexist hate, homophobia, and so on, the stereotypes surrounding us do allow, to a certain extent, the ability to express ourselves outside of gender conformity. Feminine gay men are more accepted than feminine straight men. This is because of the incorrect view that gayness eliminates masculinity in the first place, but it's still a state of being that exists. We are typically allowed to be louder and more expressive and more emotional. We're allowed to dress in brighter and gaudier clothing. Our interests in the feminine are less policed than the feminine interests of straight men. By violating the expected gendered norms through our sexuality, we are given a space in society to violate more of those norms. Real men don't cry. Because gay men aren't real men in the eyes of traditional sexists, we are allowed to cry. I can weep when bad things happen. That is a privilege I have over lots of straight men who don't think they can do that. Think back to men being seen as threats. You know, gay men are subjected to the same thing. Lesbian women, especially of the butch variety, are also subjected to this sort of dehumanizing fear. But when a gay man reveals his sexuality, especially if it accompanies a sort of stereotypical femininity, a limp wrist, their perceived threat level plummets. While we are demonized and hated by a section of the world, we are also occasionally treated as more human than our straight male counterparts. Normally, this critique of the restrictions placed on men in service to a performance of masculinity that feels restrictive and harmful to many of them and exasperates the male loneliness epidemic they're always going on about, as well as the high rates of male suicide those who bristle at the words male privilege bring up. Normally, all of that is packaged under patriarchy. That isn't incorrect, but to those with an instinctual aversion to that word, we do have to put it in another way. The performance is enforced on you. What you might consider female and gay privileges are roadblocks that do not have to exist. They can be taken down, and you can just be who you want. Consider an issue that pops up in fandom discourse in regards to shipping. Oftentimes when people start shipping two male characters, some insecure straight guy will jump into Sea Lion and start throwing out an endless series of questions along the lines of, why can't guys just be friends? I want to turn that question back in on men. Why can't men have close emotional friendships? Why can't they express non-violent skinship with each other? When I hold the hand of one of my female friends, it's not romantic, it's not sexual, it's just friendship. I've held hands with straight guys and had no inclinations toward them or against our friendship. Yet as far as I could tell, I was really the only guy those dudes would hold hands with occasionally. That's sort of interesting, isn't it? My existence as a gay man theoretically should have made holding my hand more risky than holding the hand of another straight guy. But ironically, my being gay made it less gay because subconsciously gay men are seen as unmasculine. Holding my hand, flirting with me, I don't know why straight guys do that, but they do, and so on, was actively less dangerous and less gay for them. I tend to theorize that the performance of hypermasculinity, so often what's called toxic masculinity, that is the performance of heightened cruelty under the guise of being a man, is a result of a frustrated desire for male closeness and submission. It's an expression of a sort of homosociality rather than sexuality, attempting to conform to default heterosexual sadomasochistic standards. I don't think this is a conscious move. I do think it's what's happening. Guys who are obsessed with getting the approval of alpha males are both looking for an affirmation of their own fragile masculinity and for a dominant male figure to treat them like a platonic beloved. It's a desire for submission centered around other men that, due to sexism and homophobia, cannot be openly expressed in a healthy way. Okay, I'm aware that theory is bound to be controversial, so let's move on to something that surely won't ruffle any feathers. Fourth leg up. White privilege. Feathers aren't being ruffled because none of us are angels and birds aren't real. White privilege is often the type of privilege brought up the most often after male privilege, but I wanted to follow gender up with sexuality because of how interconnected they are. Honestly, they're both quite connected to race as well. First, I want to ask, what is whiteness? I'm quite a pale individual. Sometimes people make fun of me for it, and, fair enough. My lineage is Italian, though some people assume I'm Jewish for some reason. I don't really get it. It doesn't make sense to me, but, who cares? There's a common joke on the internet that Italians are a racial minority. It's sort of funny, because we're, largely considered white, which isn't to say there aren't black Italians or any of that. Interestingly enough, Italians were not always white, at least not in the American construction of whiteness. Italian immigrants were called racial slurs, including anti-black slurs. According to Teen Vogue, anti-Italian bigots would call my predecessors white N-words. Cookbooks and sociology reports from the early 20th century refer to the Italian race. This sort of racism, as it is in Europe and Asia, is often based around xenophobia. People complained about Italians not speaking English and about Italians eating Italian food. One of the key aspects of assimilation is the general abandonment of food traditions. So this normally isn't a complete abandonment, it's just partial. And it isn't always forced. With Italians, for instance, the easy access to meat and the higher difficulty of having personal gardens and fresh produce led them to adapt and change their diet. We got more meat sauce out of it, which hell yeah. Teen Vogue partially points to Columbus Day as giving we Italians access to whiteness. In this case, whiteness is a literal privilege, something granted which can be taken away. Take the case of Jewish people. Again, I'm not Jewish. A guy once got my name out of a friend by asking, "Who's the vaguely Jewish guy you're friends with?" But I'm not Jewish. Jews and Italians do have a rich history of playing each other in films, though. Solidarity. People tend to pick and choose whether Jewish people qualify as white depending on what argument they want to make. Again, yes, this largely ignores black and brown Jewish people. White supremacists tend to view Jews as non-white. Anti-Semites who pretend to be leftists view Jews as definitely white and probably agents of white supremacy. The answer to the question, are Jews white, is if that question exists about a group, then the answer is not a definitive yes. White is an ever-changing category. It's likely that one day light-skinned Jewish people will simply be thought of as white. Given how the US works, that's also potentially true of non-black Latinos. Like Jewish people, there are those who consider Latinos definitely not white, and a segment of, I don't really know what to call them in this case, vaguely left adjacent people who consider the only races to be black, white, and Asian. Latinos, in that second group's mind, are mostly white people. We also know historically that whiteness is not purely about skin color. I'm about to say something upsetting, so skip a little bit ahead if you need to. When dissecting the trope of the tragic mulatto throughout literature and film, Dr. David Pilgrim writes, "All enslaved women, and men, and children, were vulnerable to being raped. But the mulatto afforded the slave owner the opportunity to rape, with impunity, a woman who was physically white, or near white, but legally black." How does white privilege pop up? Well, in job hiring a lot. Yes, still. People with black-sounding names tend to be hired less often than those with white-sounding or racially ambiguous names. Those who hate the idea of white privilege being a thing, or at least are anti-affirmative action, are even more likely to discriminate against black-sounding names. White privilege is that your name is less likely to cause your application to be rejected than a black person's name. It is not saying that your life is great and problem-free. It's probably not. It's saying that you don't have this specific additional problem to deal with. Similar to names, hair is another place of white privilege. Stick with me. A study showed that people are less likely to rate a profile as professional when the associated photo has curlier hair. A fifth of black women have been disciplined at work for wearing their natural hair. Now, obviously, it is patently ridiculous to claim a successful white person is successful because of their hair. That's not what's being said, though. I have a naturally large cowlick, like right here. When my hair is short, it sticks out in a giant whirlpool. That cowlick hasn't provided me with anything. But I've never been discriminated against because of my hair. No one has had to pass legislation to make it illegal to discriminate against me for my natural hair. Perhaps the clearest example of this comes from interactions with the police. Despite being just over 1/10 of the population in the US, black people make up just under 1/3 of all police-caused fatalities. If you are black in America, you are twice as likely to be shot by a police officer as a white American. That does not mean more white people need to be shot. It does not mean interacting with the cops is a pleasant experience for non-minorities. I've been a passenger a few times in a car when someone was pulled over. I was trembling each time in the passenger seat, not because I did anything wrong or because the cop was being aggressive. It's because I'm just terrified of getting in trouble and of the police as a concept. My whiteness doesn't make police officers not scary, maybe it's my Italian blood, but it does make them statistically less dangerous for me. Fearing police officers more decreases trust, decreases reporting of crimes, and decreases intra-community justice. Like the other categories, we could go on about this forever. Can we think about it in the opposite at all? Maybe. Since whiteness is a bestowed category in America, one that's meant to subsume those granted it, it has a habit of consuming culture. You're more likely to have a sincere cultural connection outside of a vague Americanness the further from whiteness you are, or the more recently that acceptance has taken place. White Americans of distant English descent are less likely to feel connected to their British heritage than an Italian American is to our Italianness. Part of this is because, for instance, Black Americans, especially those descendant from slaves, had to create a culture to survive the oppressions of slavery and Jim Crow. You can argue sometimes that this cultural connection is a sort of privilege. It gives a sort of meaning to your life. White Americans salivate over so-called Western heritage because they do not have a specific cultural connection and feel the need for one in order to attach meaning to their lives and the lives of their predecessors. In a way, you could argue cultural connection is a sort of antidote against existentialist crises. You could also maybe make the argument that proximity to coolness is a non-white privilege insofar as American Black culture and in certain pockets Japanese culture are seen as the centers of cool. Me and my fellow white people are more likely to be corny. And yeah, I'm a very corny individual, that's fine. Do coolness and corniness actually matter? No, I think they're pointless categories, but they can affect someone's life in small ways that can add up. In that way, it maybe makes it easier to conceptualize privilege, not as a denigration of who you are and what you've done or your ancestors or heritage, but an academic exercise in discussing the barriers that do and do not exist, depending on things largely beyond your control. Maybe like with maleness, my confusion over this is largely because I don't have a strong desire to identify with any specific culture or inheritance. I talk a lot about being Italian, but it's mostly jokes. It's not that important to me. I don't speak the language. I don't make pasta. I've never been to Italy. I don't really want to do any of those things. My closest connections are that I like heaping garlic on food and I like making Italian focaccia loaves. If I went to where my family lived in Sicily a few generations back, I don't think I'd feel a connection to it. I'm white, like I am a man, but it's not that important to me. In a way, my lack of care about whiteness and maleness is a sort of privilege in itself. I have to care about my identity as a gay person because my gayness is subject to oppression. It's easy for me to kind of assume I'd care more about my gender and race if those two were subjected to oppressions. At the same time, my lack of care sort of inoculates me against the anxieties and pressures of the men and white people who do find themselves so concerned with those categories and parts of their identities. So, as I said, I don't really understand this concern with so-called anti-white racism. Most of the time I've seen it come up has been people complaining about programs that aim not to harm white people, but to help disadvantaged minorities. Curious that. Fifth leg up. Healthy privilege. Speaking of curious things, every now and then when I work out, I get possessed by a heavy despair. That's curious. I've dealt with this a bunch of times, and there doesn't really seem to be a consensus on why this happens for some people. Like, people talk about a runner's high. Exercise is supposed to make you feel good. It's supposed to improve your mental health. Where does this sudden depression come from then? Some people in health blogs I've looked into over the years claim it was working too strenuously, too quickly, moving beyond your limits in a way you shouldn't. Others said the body can store trauma and stress and negative hormones in fat storages, so sometimes exercise will release those stored hormones and cause negative mental states. That sucks. People who are able to exercise consistently without hitting the despair edge, that's a fucking privilege, man. I am jealous of you. I still exercise, it's a choice, and I'm trying to treat myself and my body better, but it would be easier without the roadblock of always risking a mental breakdown in the middle of cardio for no goddamn reason. That is a segue into talking about healthy privilege, or more accurate, able-bodied privilege. Does this mean your ability to exercise without wanting to die is the reason your life is great? Does it mean you never want to die? Does it mean your life is great at all? No. Despite what people claim, that is not what is meant by privilege. In my video talking about Luigi Mangione, I talk about some of the places where healthcare is lacking in our country, especially economically. It is expensive to stay in a hospital, to have an ambulance ride, to get surgery, to get medication. In that video, I talk about how less medications are being covered by insurance. That makes it harder for unhealthy, sickly, or disabled people who need medical attention to afford their lives. It provides an additional economic barrier. It's not to mention other barriers. You can imagine that person A who has cancer and person B who has the exact same qualities, jobs, relationships, and so forth in a mirror universe, but who does not have cancer, live vastly different lives of differing degrees of difficulty. The lack of cancer does not give person B their other qualities, opportunities, and relationships. They're the same person. But that lack of cancer does afford them an easier life. Not having cancer can be considered a privilege. Fibromyalgia runs in my family. Last time I checked, we don't know what the hell that is. I can tell you what it causes my family members to go through. Constant, unending pain. Sometimes it's debilitating, sometimes it's more numb, but it's pretty much always there. They have to get used to it. To a certain degree, like a person living in a smelly room goes nose blind, they have to go a bit nerve blind in order to function in society. This constant pain is a detriment. I do not have fibro. There are parts of my life that still suck. Not having fibro did not stop those men from assaulting me. But I do not have to live every single day in some form of constant pain. That is a sort of privilege. I do not share that specific roadblock. You can take this same idea and apply it to all disability. A person who does not have a cognitive disability is not guaranteed to have a happy life, but neurotypical privilege means they are not disadvantaged by means of a society constructed against the way their brain is wired. Not having dyslexia is easier than having dyslexia. I'm partially concerned that it feels like I'm talking down or talking to no one. Like, is anyone still watching? Have I made it easier to conceptualize and understand the conversation? Has it caused you to determine a different word or phrase is maybe needed to discuss a real phenomenon? Or are you simply finding me annoying? I am annoying. Regardless, let's talk about Theo Von's concern and the concern a lot of people who don't enjoy conversations about social politics actually have. Sixth leg up, economic privilege. According to a study from Georgetown University, family wealth is a stronger indication of future monetary success than personal intelligence and work ethic. When people bristle at conversations about privilege, class is often their focus. Maybe they are a straight, cis, able-bodied white man, and they still struggle to pay off student loans, to afford childcare, to make rent, to pay for a loved one's health issues, to move, to feel comfort. Work hours and commitments fill them with stress and eat away their free time. They spend their time at home not doing what they love, but rather taking care of the home and trying to rest enough to face the next day of work in order to afford the next month of being alive, on and on and on until they die. When these people hear that they have privilege, it's a bit understandable that they might get annoyed, because they're struggling. Their lives kind of suck. When Theo Von mentions this and the struggles of younger generations, his interview guest agrees. He says class struggles are maybe the most important sort of struggle in contemporary politics. Then, though, he makes sure to gently suggest to Theo Von that these issues faced by poor white people are more difficult for poor black people because they have additional hurdles, not because the poor white person's life is great. If you're poor and almost no one is willing to hire you into high-paying positions due to having a black-sounding name, it's going to be that much harder to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. People on my side of the aisle are quick to suggest Trump supporters are racist and sexist. You know, I'm quite sympathetic to that, in that Trump's personal sexism and racism and ableism and transphobia and homophobia were not deal breakers for these voters. They claim to have voted with their wallet, but economic insecurity has been used to whitewash bigotry before. Yet, isn't that too easy of a story? More than anything else, politics is about storytelling. Despite what people want to tell themselves, it is not a series of rational choices made by rational actors, only acting in relation to changing facts and situations. Politics is theater. Politicians and commentators are actors performing stories. That is their job. Behind closed doors, they push policy, sure. But the best stories are easily digestible, shareable, and summarizable. Memes are often important in contemporary political communication because they are all three of those things. Many of these stories and performances are sincere. It's important to note that. That doesn't make them true or factual, though, or even sensible. Take populism. Populism is not restricted to the left or the right. It pops up in plenty of political movements. Populism is the story of the real people versus the evil elites. Drain the Swamp is right-wing populism. Feel the Burn was left-wing populism in a lot of cases. If you examine populist movements, you start to find harsh contradictions that would not survive rational review. For instance, Trumpian populism casts the elites not as billionaires, CEOs, or successful entertainers of news or sport. It isn't even about politicians who abuse their office for personal gain. The elites are college professors, blue-haired baristas, left-wing protesters and cultural commentators, academics, and non-conservative artists. Elite here doesn't really have anything to do with power, except for maybe a sort of social power and artistic power. Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, is not the elite, purely because he is aligned with that movement. Because populism is a story of the real people versus the evil elite, it cannot allow for members of the elite to be allies or for normal people to be opposition. So then populism is not about an actual reality. It's about an emotionality, a performance, a catharsis. Trumpian politics is rife with performative cruelty, because once you have dehumanized the opposition as evil elites, you can throw whatever abuses you want at them. This happens on the left as well. I have a video calling out so-called leftists who seem to primarily engage with leftism not as a vehicle for enacting policy, but to be cruel. Specifically, I talk about leftists who gladly use slurs. These left-wing populists, like every other sort of populist, are not advocating for a coherent set of enactable policies. They're looking for the enemy to whom it is acceptable to be cruel. They require the evil elite in order to fulfill the theater they have chosen to accept as the correct story. People got a bit mad at me for that video because to say it's bad to be an asshole makes you an enemy of the populist. It harms a fragile, incoherent story. Why do people turn to populism? Why are they searching for the catharsis of performative cruelty and sadism? Why do they flip out when you critique their sadism? But it doesn't come out of nothing. A lot of it is that social media is a toxic wasteland that has harmed humanity. Some of it, though, is that people are legitimately suffering, and the easy story of populism gives them someone to blame, an enemy to defeat, whose defeat will magically alleviate their suffering. So, Trump supporters are bigots is another easy story. It's not made out of thin air. Those who support Trump from the populist side often are bigots because all populists are really just searching to perform cruelty. It's kind of inherent to the nature. But that does not mean all people who voted for Trump are right-wing, performatively cruel populists. Regardless of whether their perception of the economy was correct, there are those who voted for Trump out of the belief that he would be able to help their wallet. The more money your parents make, on average, the more money you will make. The richer your parents, the more likely you are to go to and complete college. The richer they are, the less likely a teenage girl is to get pregnant. To grow up in a wealthy household provides a boon. But we're also all aware that wealthy people aren't happy, right? How many celebrities have killed themselves? Elon Musk sure seems miserable. Money does not inoculate you against the human condition. Nothing does that. So it's easy to see that saying being raised in a higher class is a privilege does not mean your life is necessarily great or perfect, or that you're happy. A rich woman like Taylor Swift can still be the subject of a dehumanizing AI deepfake porn attack. Everyone struggles. Seventh leg up. Okay, that's too many legs. Let's just finish this video. When the word privilege is used in this context, it has nothing to do with whether or not the privileged person is happy, successful, or deserving of anything. It is about whether or not you have a specific roadblock. To not have a roadblock is a privilege. It does not mean that you do not have other blocks. The knowledge that each human is made up of many struggles that play upon each other in different and varied ways is known as intersectionality. It is about the ways identities and so-called material realities and circumstances intersect. I am a gay white man with mental health issues. I have some blocks. I don't have others. A black woman has different blocks than I do. She has different blocks than a disabled black woman, and they both have different blocks than a poor straight white dude, and he has different blocks than a rich bisexual Asian man. Identity and life are complicated. They are too complicated for the simple stories political movements are often based on. They are definitely too complicated for the hateful stories of populism. There are other privileges we could talk about. Cis privileges means you are not subjected to the same things a trans person is in regards to your health, relationships, and rights. Country of origin can be a privilege. Those who were born in the United States in 2024 have already had a better life than those who were born in Israel and Gaza, in Ukraine, in Syria in 2024. That has nothing to do with the individual baby. It is about the circumstances surrounding them and how those circumstances will affect them. It is about the blocks placed into their path beyond their control. It is worse to be born into a war zone. That does not mean those American babies are bound to have fantastic lives or weren't born into misery. It doesn't mean those born in areas subjected to war are bound to have horrid lives. Pretty privilege shows up in that people tend to be nicer to prettier people. They tend to be more desired. We have plenty of evidence that being stereotypically pretty does not mean one is without struggle. In my mind, most people were aware of this about privilege, but I'm choosing to be optimistic and say that some people simply did not know and were not acting in any sort of malice. But now you do know. Privilege is really shorthand for all of this. It's used for easy communication. If it confused you before, maybe this long video wasn't a waste of time. I choose to believe it helped someone. All I ask is, regardless of your view on this entire thing, you consider the old axiom: everyone is fighting a war. Yours and mine probably look different. I wish you success and rest and an easier tomorrow. And I hope you can hope the same for me. Howdy, and thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, share if you're feeling saucy. You can join me over on Patreon if you would like, wherein you'll get these videos and others early. You'll also get to have some fun behind the scenes access to some of my art projects, some more personal vlogging style content, and you'll just get to support me and we'll get to chat about art a whole bunch, which is what I love to do most. you can go over to Amazon Smashwords or wherever you get your ebooks and purchase a copy of my poetry collections, Butterfly Snuff and A Museum of Art in Eggs, both of which are also available in paperback and hardback. I have a second channel where I'm just reading through a bunch of public domain stuff for the fun of it and through my own work, so you'll get readings of these poetry collections and some short stories and some longer form fiction when I get around to it, and some plays. And I have a third channel where I'm uploading my music and art instead of having it all clog up this channel. So go support those if you feel like it. That content, a lot of it will also be getting uploaded early to Patreon. So if you want all of my stuff in one convenient space, Patreon is the place to go, which would be really cool of you, you know? I hope you have a fantastic day. Do not be rude in the comments. Do not go and harass anybody. And I will see you next time.